Hello all, so this is the Philosophy of Antiques lecture. Let's just see if this loads up. Yep, there it is. So it might seem like a bit of a strange subject, the philosophy of antiques, but it's one that's very close to my heart. As I'll explain later, for a short time, I was running a little antiques business. Not much of a business. I was buying and selling a few bits and bobs here and there. And I got interested in the notion of an antique and realised that very few people had written in philosophy on antiques. And I teamed up with another guy who works at, which university is he at now? Anyway, he was at the University of Birmingham at the time. And we got talking about antiques. He's a healthcare economist, but an academic nonetheless. And we wrote a paper and published it on the philosophy of antiques. And I'm going to be talking about that paper today and its relation to another paper in the literature by a guy called Leon Rosenstein. So I'll try and generate an interest in the philosophy of antiques as we go. It's a bit odd for me recording these online videos because I prefer to ask people questions and gauge understanding and so on in a live setting, but we'll see how we go. I'm going to start, at any rate, just by giving a few comments about antiques in general before we move on to the philosophical side of things, raise a few questions about them, and then you'll see how the issues arise from that. I'll probably record this video in sort of two chunks rather than one continuous video. But anyway, I'll clearly label those Antiques Lecture 1, Antiques Lecture 2 or something. So, okay, so let's begin with this. So here is a picture from inside a auction house. In fact, this is a local auction house. This is Bamford's in Derby. And you'll see in there a bunch of different objects, right? You got some books, you got some little ornaments, you got a vase, you got some pictures, you've got tables and chairs and a doll's house there on the right. And there's a question about which one of these things counts as antiques and which one doesn't. And that's the real question that I'm going to be interested in here, with the question of what is an antique. Now, there are certain things which I think are definitely antiques and everybody agrees are antiques. These are some examples of them. So they, date back hundreds of years. They're made from good materials. They're well crafted, and so on and so forth. And everybody would class these things as antiques. I mean, I'll come back to them in a while and talk a bit more about particular examples. But it's worth noting, look, that quite often what you'll find is there are patterns for antiques, or there are kind of cabinet makers, as they're called, would often produce things like patterns for which chairs and various objects are to be made. So there's an example of that one in the flesh, based on the designs there, and the various famous cabinet makers who put these designs together. I'm not going to go into any great detail about the history of all the actual historical details here. But I want to just point to something like this. And this was something which was being sold at another local auction house. So I took this photo when I was down there. This was in Arthur Johnson's in the cattle market in Nottingham. And you look at that and you think, well, is that an antique or is it not an antique? And exactly how do we classify it as such? And the interesting thing about this one is it's actually got a bit missing from it. So this would originally have had a mirror. So I tried to find a kind of picture that would exemplify what I mean here. I couldn't really find an exact picture, but it would have looked something like that originally. Not exactly like that, but it would have had an extra piece on it, right? A kind of mirror on the back. So that's an incomplete piece, if anything. And should we still count that as being an antique, given that it's not complete? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. That's one question we'll come back to. Often things are converted as well. So here's a very simple example. Maybe you think that original desk there was an antique, in bad condition there, but maybe it was. But then it's converted into a nightstand. Does the nightstand count? Is that an antique nightstand? Or is it rather a non-antique, a new item of furniture that's made from an antique? Has the antiqueness survived, as it were? So these are sort of questions. I'm just raising some questions at the moment. Here's another example of this kind of a thing, where an old wardrobe, so that's an Edwardian wardrobe, has been turned into like a wash stand and converted. And there's good questions about whether the conversion process destroys the original antique and actually creates a new piece of furniture or not. In actual fact, looking at that, it does look like that's not the exact one that was converted, but you get the idea, right? Somebody has converted a wardrobe of that kind. Okay. Yeah, it's worth mentioning. There's this chap here. He's John Hobbs. So he recently, he was one of the most famous antique dealers in the country, and he recently faced, a few years ago, faced some difficulties because what he was doing was he was getting this chap here. He's his cabinet maker, and he was buying in items of furniture. For example, he bought this item in, the Hobbs fellow, the antique dealer, and he got this chap, who was his cabinet maker, to convert that into a thing that looked like this, and then sold it as an antique piece for way more than the original piece would have sold for, right? So you can find out about this guy, actually. It's worth, I'll show you. So what was his name? John Hobbs. So if you want to know about this John Hobbs antique dealer, there in 2011, there's a piece there. So this is where he died recently, but yes, his restorer, his cabinet maker, accused him of selling fakes. You can read about him there. But the point is, there's nothing actually at the moment there's nothing in the law which defines exactly what an antique is or what's to count as such. And he couldn't face any financial prosecution, even though it looked like this was, in some sense, a fake and not a genuine antique. Okay. All right. So we've got these questions about what counts as an antique. I'm just giving an example here of something that isn't. So this here is what's called a reproduction or a repro. It's made in exactly the same style as an old antique desk would have been made, but it's a modern one, so it's probably only about 20, 30 years old, something like that. So one of the key things that people think of when they think about an antique is, well, I'll come to it in a minute, is whether it's old or not. Now, we're going to see that this one isn't old. It's only 20 years old, so old, we will have to talk about exactly what we mean by being old. But this one isn't old and doesn't count as an antique, it seems, for that reason. All right, so we'll come back to the question of age in a minute, which seems to be an important feature of antiques. Okay, so there's just a few introductory comments to sort of give you some examples of the kinds of issues that might arise, and we'll get a better handle on those as we go. So if we're asking the question, what is an antique? It seems that if you look at the philosophical literature, there's lots and lots of work on the question of what is art or what is an artwork. And there's lots of different accounts and discussion where the question is taken to be, if you ask the question in philosophy, what is art? It's what we want to do to answer that question is to attempt to give an analysis of the concept of being an artwork. So just to be clear about what the question, what is art, means, we're taken to have the concept of art, and then we want to know, well, under what circumstances do we apply the term being an artwork or being a piece of art to something? And we want to analyse that concept. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So it's a matter of conceptual analysis when people ask the question, what is art? And it turns out that there's very little on the concept of being an antique. So although there's been a huge amount of literature, philosophical literature on the question, what is art, there's very little on the concept of being an antique. And I find this somewhat odd. I found this somewhat odd at the time. So as I said, I was buying and selling antique furniture for a while. And being a philosopher, I looked up what is an antique and what philosophical work had been done on it. And there was almost nothing. There was very, very, very little indeed. And I thought, well, that's odd, really, because, I mean, given that there's so much on what is art, because antiques at least seem to be at least as much part of people's everyday lives, as it were, as artwork is. You know, everyone knows of the Antique Roadshow on the telly. Auction houses around the country are attended by thousands and thousands of people every week. Many people have antiques in their homes and so on. So it's like, well, I wonder why nobody's really done any work on what it is to be an antique. And I still don't really know the answer to that question. Given that so much has been devoted to the notion of art, why so little on being an antique? Anyway, so I had a look around, and the only work that I could find on the concept of an antique was by this guy, Leon Rosenstein. And in fact, it comes in two forms. So the first, he wrote a journal article in 1987 called The Aesthetic of the Antique in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And the second was a 2009 book, Antiques, The History of an Idea. So there it is. And that was it. So there was these two bits of work, the 1987 journal article and the 2009 book, and there was nothing else. So it was a bit of a dearth, basically. Anyway, I was interested. I got hold of the article, I got hold of the book, started to read through them, and realised that I actually disagreed with a lot of what Rosenstein said. So we'll come to my work on this, along with my co-author, who I'll talk about, Darren Baines, shortly. So, okay, there's the background. We're interested in the question, what is an antique? I was interested there in giving a conceptual analysis, i.e. trying to give an account of what an antique is, in a similar vein to the question, what is art, and people trying to give an analysis of the concept of art. And as a starting point, I looked at Leon Rosenstein's work on this. All right. So here is the question, it's sort of a sub-question. Must antiques be old? So a way of understanding that question in terms of conceptual analysis is we ask the question, is being old a necessary condition for being an antique? And I'll come to it, we'll come on to what that means in more detail shortly. Now, I guess if people think about what it is to be an antique, it almost seems obvious. So a natural thought is, well, maybe there are almost certainly going to be other conditions that something has to meet in order to be an antique. But surely an antique has got to be something that's old. So surely a necessary condition of being an antique is that it is old. I actually want to claim that this isn't true. And I'm going to give the argument for that. I don't think it is a necessary condition of being an antique that it has to be old. And that is supposed to strike you, I suppose, as being controversial or at least puzzling. I'm going to defend that claim. But just to be clear up front, more specifically and more, I suppose, more correctly, the claim is this, more carefully. It's not analytic that antiques are old. So if you remember the notion of an analytic truth, so an analytic truth is one that's true in virtue of the meanings of the terms involved. So a classic example is bachelors are unmarried men. That's supposed to be an analytic truth. You know, the concept of a bachelor somehow contains, in a Kantian metaphor, but you know, the concept of a bachelor contains the concept of being male and the concept of being old. My claim is that it's not part of the concept of being an antique that the object is old. As we'll see, it does turn out, as I hope it seems sensible, that all antiques, as a matter of fact, are old. At least all the ones. Well, maybe there's actually a few examples of new antiques, but we'll see. But the key claim is it's not part of the concept of an antique that it's old. That's my claim, and I'll try and argue for that as we go. All right then, so let's turn to the question, what is an antique? And in order to answer this question, I want to introduce a distinction, first of all. So this is a sort of a bit of technical work of two types of concept. So the first type of concept I'm going to call a strict concept, and the second is what I'm going to call a family resemblance concept. These are distinctions that are often, not my distinction exactly, It's a distinction that's well known within the philosophical literature. So let's explain what these are. So just so you know where we are at the moment, we're going to try to give an analysis of the concept of an antique using conceptual analysis. But first of all, we've got to make a distinction between strict concepts and family resemblance concepts to get into that. Okay. So let's do the bit of technical work. And I hope you can follow. See, normally, again, right, what I would do is if I was presenting this to a class, I would run through this and ask people to put their hands up if they've understood and ask questions. So let's see. We'll see how we go. So first, the notion of a strict concept. Now, a strict concept is one where it's possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions for them. And I hope that the notion of necessary and sufficient conditions is a familiar one to you now. So we did go over this in the first year, but I'll give some examples. So look, let's take the concept of a bachelor. To give an analysis of the concept of a bachelor, the if and only if there, so the IFF stands for if and only if. And whenever we give, well, that expresses the idea of necessary and sufficient conditions. So we can say this: S is a bachelor if and only if, number one, S is unmarried, and number two, S is male. All right, so what does this mean exactly? Well, it means this. It means that those two conditions, number one and number two, are both necessary conditions of being a bachelor. That is, if something is to count as being a bachelor, it must be unmarried and it must be male. Those are two individually necessary conditions. So if something is to be a bachelor, it must be one and it must be two, right? But neither of those conditions alone is said to be a sufficient condition for being a bachelor. That is to say, just because something's unmarried, it's not enough to make it a bachelor, right? Because you could have an unmarried female and they don't count as bachelors. And likewise, being male is not a sufficient condition for being a bachelor either. Something could be male. For example, a married male is not a bachelor. So neither of those conditions are sufficient on their own, even though they are each of them necessary. But if you take them together, being unmarried and being male is a sufficient condition of being a bachelor, right? So if something is unmarried and is male, and perhaps it has to be human as well, but we're supposing we're talking about people. So if a person is unmarried and is male, then they are a bachelor. So those conditions then are individually necessary for being a bachelor and they are jointly sufficient, right? If something is a bachelor, it must be both of them. And if something is both of them, then it is a bachelor. So that's an example of a strict concept. So a strict concept is one where it's possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions like that for being a thing of its kind. Okay, so that's the first example. I'll give another example of this. So here's an example that may be familiar to you from epistemology. It turns out that this is not a correct analysis of knowledge, but it gives an example of people have tried to give an analysis of knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions in this way. S knows that P if and only if P is true, S believes that P, and S's belief is justified. So that's known as the tripartite account of knowledge. And again, the idea is meant to be that in order for somebody to know something, 1, 2, and 3 are all necessary conditions of that, and together they are sufficient, right? So that's another example. Turns out that, as I said, that's not a good. There's the Gettier counterexamples, if you remember those. So the Gettier counterexamples, in effect, show that somebody can meet the conditions without knowing something. So the Gettier counterexamples try to show that those 3 conditions are not sufficient for knowledge. At any rate, we're not going to go through that now. And don't worry if you've forgotten maths. It's not going to be important in what follows. What's important is that you've got this general idea of necessary and sufficient conditions. And if it's possible to give such, then you've got a strict concept. Now, look, here are some... I said that there's a lot of work on the notion of an artwork. And here's some examples of people who think, or different accounts of what is art given in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So here's one account. This is one attempt at giving a definition of art in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So S is an artwork if and only if, and it just gives one condition here, but it's supposed to be, that one condition is supposed to be both necessary and sufficient. So anything that is an artwork is supposed to meet that condition, and anything that meets that condition is supposed to be an artwork. S is an artwork if and only if. S is intended to provide the person who contemplates it for its own sake with an aesthetic experience of a significant magnitude on the basis of an appreciation of its aesthetic features. Okay, so there's an account. I'm not going to go into this. I just want to say, look, here's one example of a definition of an artwork given in terms of necessary sufficient condition. This one's called aesthetic functionalism. There are others. So whether or not that's correct, it's disputed whether that's the correct account. There's the institutional theory. S is an artwork if and only if. S is an artifact of a kind created by an artist to be presented to an art world public. Again, I'm not defending these. I'm just giving them as examples of people who think that you can give an analysis of the concept of an artwork in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Historicism, another example. These examples I've adapted from Davis 2006. I can give, it's not really going to be important. I can give that reference to people if they want. So yeah, there we go. Those are examples. Now, we're not going to be interested in the concept of an artwork. It's just to say, look, people have tried to give necessary and sufficient conditions and therefore have thought that the concept of an artwork is a strict concept. All right. Now we're going to move to the notion of a family resemblance concept. So all what we've just done is just to say a strict concept is one where it's possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions like that, and people have thought that artwork can be given a definition like that. All right, now consider, here's Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is from his Philosophical Investigations. Quote, a couple of quotes here. So he says, consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something in common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to them all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, he says, don't think, but look. So what he's getting at here is saying, look, do you think that there's any kind of a core element that all games have got together? Can we give necessary and sufficient conditions for what it is to be a game? And he's here saying, don't assume that there must be necessary and sufficient conditions. There must be something that's in common to all games. Just have a look at the different types of games and see whether that's true. He continues. So he gives some examples of games and he continues. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. So he's thinking here of different types of games. Are they all amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses. Or is there always winning and losing or competition between players? Think of patience. So that's a single player game, right? In ball games, there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. What Wittgenstein's really pointing to here is that games are all of different types, and every time you think you might have something that all games share in common, you're always going to find an example of a game that doesn't have that in common. All right, so what's the relevance of this? Well, we can get to the relevance of Wittgenstein's comments here by looking at a different account of art. So I'm sticking with this notion of art in a minute. I'm going to shift across to antiques. So this is Boris Gaut, and Gaut gives what he calls an anti-definitional account of art. And his idea here is that roughly this: you can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for being an artwork. In other words, he doesn't think that being an artwork is a strict concept in the terms I've outlined, but rather he thinks there are a cluster of conditions such that if an artwork meets them, enough of them, then it is art. Okay, so we'll come to that in a second. Actually, maybe it's going to be worthwhile maybe I can open up a sort of a drawer. Why is it called family resemblance in, so quick draw, let's draw, oh no, that's a game. I want to go to a auto draw, maybe I can do it here. That was my testing out of this to see whether it works. Let's have a new, start over. Okay, so look, I'm going to try and draw. To be honest, I'm going to have to draw with my finger on the screen, but I think you'll get the idea. So let's take, these are meant to be 3 members of the same family, okay? And, you know, what you might notice with members of the same family is, so this one here might have, I'll draw a triangular nose, right? This one here might have a square nose, and this one will have a triangular nose as well. Okay, so let's see if we can get this right. This one might have sort of big spiky hair, and this one might have big spiky hair, and the third one might be bald there. So this is a very crude example, but it turns out that, you know, the members of this family are related by what are called family resemblances. So if you look at these two, it turns out that they're related by having big spiky hair, but their noses are different. Whereas if you compare this one and this one, then they're related by having triangular noses, but their hair is different. So we need one more example. Let's suppose then that this one has got big eyes and this one has got big eyes, something like that. And then you look at those two and they're related by having big eyes, but their hair and their noses are different. So there's no sort of single feature that any of these have got in common, right? Each of them differ in at least one feature, but they bear resemblances to each other, and there are certain clusters of features that they have in common. Anyway, that's meant to be a very rough idea. Why does Wittgenstein call this? So Wittgenstein introduces the notion of family resemblance, and it's because he thinks that members of family, they might not share any particular features in common, but they'll have these clusters of features which you know, differ between the different groups. So that's the idea of, that's why we're going to call this a family resemblance concept that we're going to talk about now. So we'll go back to Boris Gauss and his anti-definitional account of art. I'll try and summarize what we're talking about in a minute. So just go with it for the time being. If you're not sure, I'll summarize. So this is how we're going to spell out this in more detail. So now let's consider 4 x's. So an x here is meant to be like just a general type of object. So let's consider 4 random, we're going to call them x's. These are 4 x's. Here's the first x. So this is an individual type of thing, an x. And let's suppose that it's got, so it could be a member of a family, for example, and it's got 3 properties. So A, B, and C are supposed to be properties of x. Okay. Here's our second x, and its 3 properties are B, C, and D, right? And our third x has got properties A, C, and D, and our fourth one has got properties B, D, and E, okay? So those are meant to be 4 different x's. They might be 4 members of the same family or something like that, or doesn't really matter. They're 4 types of thing x, and those are the properties that they have. So, okay, hopefully this will make sense. And we can define what it is to be an x in the following way. And we still give an if and only if, but we're no longer giving conditions necessary exactly. We're not stating properties that any of them, I'll put it this way, there's no necessary properties that any of these have. So, you know, we're saying it has at least 3 of the properties A, B, C, D, and E, all right? So here we say, what is it to be an x? Well, to be an x is to have at least 3 of these properties. And then if we look across at our x's, it turns out that each of them are an x indeed, because each of them has at least 3 of those 5 properties. So the first x has A, B, and C, the second x has B, C, and D, and so on. But note here that no 2 x's share a single property in common, right? So we've got a definition of an x according to which they have to have a cluster of the properties from the group, but no individual x has to have any one of the properties, right? So the idea here is none of the properties A, B, C, D, or E count as being necessary properties or not a necessary condition of being an X that it has any one of them. So there are no necessary properties for being an X, but nonetheless we can define an X as something which has those three. So I hope that makes sense. This is the idea of a family resemblance concept. So a concept turns out to be a family resemblance concept if there aren't necessary conditions, but rather there's no necessary property that they all must have, but there's a cluster of properties that each of them must have. I hope that makes sense. I'll give another example. This is a slightly more complicated example, but we'll see why it's useful to consider it in the abstract. So yeah, I mean, I'll point that out as well, that we are considering this at the moment in the abstract. If you find this hard to follow, stick with it, and I think it will maybe become clearer when we consider the concrete example in a minute. Okay. Now we'll consider three Y's. So these are other types of objects. Here's our first Y. It's got A, B, and D. Here's our second Y. It's got B, C, and D. Here's our third Y. So here we've got three Y's that have got these properties. And now consider this definition of a Y. S is a Y if and only if S has D and at least two of A, B, and C. So here we have got a necessary property for being a Y. That is the property of being D. So being D is a necessary condition for being a Y. But here there's no sufficient set of conditions, right? So, there are no single set of properties that's enough to make something a D. There are rather many different sets of properties. So something is a Y if it's got D and then it's got A and B, or it's D and it's got B and C, and it's D and it's got A and C. But it doesn't, there's no single set of sufficient conditions. That is, there's no set of conditions you can lay down to say that every D must have, having those properties are the ones that make something a Y. There are lots of different sets of sufficient conditions. Okay, so when I say there's no set of sufficient conditions here, rather than there's no single set of sufficient conditions. All right, so another thing here is worth noting. In this case, so consider our three Y's. If anyone loses any one of its properties, so if it loses D, it's not going to be a Y anymore, right? Because a Y must have D. But likewise, if Y number one loses A, it's going to cease to be a Y, because a Y must have D in at least one of A, B, and C, and so on. So in this case, we can say each of the properties possessed by each of our Y's is a Y maker. That's a bit of terminology I'm introducing. And I'll try and explain why all this is relevant. Okay, so I hope you've been following that. I know it's a little bit technical and a little bit maybe difficult to grasp in the abstract, but I'll try to spell out when we come to the concrete example why it's important. And by the way, this is why I find this quite difficult to do recording, because normally I want to ask people questions, people who are sitting in front of me when I'm giving a class, and get some feedback and see whether I've explained things well enough. I like that kind of feedback. That's why I think that live lectures are important. Anyway, hopefully it'll be okay. And remember that feel free to ask me questions about this. Once I've posted the lecture, you can send me any questions you like, and you've got a chance to discuss this in the seminar with Ruth as well. But do feel free to get in touch and ask me questions if you wish. All right, now we're going to turn to Leon Rosenstein and his work on the concept of being an antique. So here's some quotes from Rosenstein. So if you remember, so let me summarize where we've got to. I've given some brief comments on what it is to be an antique. We've said, look, we're going to be interested in the question, what is an antique? Then I've introduced a distinction between two types of concepts, strict concepts and family resemblance concepts. I've said that there's not a lot of work on what it is to be an antique, and Rosenstein is about the only person who has worked on this. So we're now looking at what Rosenstein says about the concept of being an antique. So here's a quote. He says, "It will always turn out that some aspects of a given object's antiqueness may be a matter of more or less, and it may be that, in the long run, only family resemblances can be discovered among the things we call antiques." And then he goes on to give a set of conditions that he says any antique must have a cluster of them. So, right, you can see here that what he's saying is, I don't think that we can give necessary and sufficient conditions for being an antique. I think it's going to turn out to be a family resemblance concept. That's why we've introduced those two types of concept. Rosenstein wants to say the concept of being an antique is not a strict concept, but it's rather a family resemblance concept. Okay? So, spelling that out, he gives the following. He says, look, here's the list of properties that go into making an antique, but we're not going to be able to give necessary and sufficient conditions. He says, antique has got to be technically perfect. It's got to have a certain age. It's got to be notion of a subject. I'll explain what these means in due course. It's got to have a certain provenance, condition, completeness, rarity, size, context. Okay, so those are the list of properties that anything he thinks an antique must have, at least some cluster of them. Remember, he doesn't think that an antique has to have all of them, and he doesn't think that, right? Okay. Now, he also seems to suggest that those three, technical perfection, age, and subject, and we'll talk about what those mean in a minute, he thinks that these are necessary parts of the cluster. So it's a bit like that example that we just gave with what it is to be a Y, where D was in the necessary, you know, anything that was a Y had to be a D. Here he thinks, look, if something is an antique, it's got to have technical perfection, it's got to be of a certain age, and it's got to have a certain subject, but then it's got to have a certain cluster of these other ones as well. It's got to have a certain provenance, condition, completeness, and so on. I hope that makes sense. So, right? So that's his account. There is no necessary and sufficient conditions for being an antique. Rather, it's a family resemblance concept where an antique must have these three and then a certain cluster of the others, but there aren't any single sufficient conditions. All right. So that's where we get to, and maybe I'll pause at this point and before moving on to my own account. So we're going to move now to what I and my co-author, when we wrote this, think about this. So, okay, there I'll pause for the time being, and I'll start. How long have we been going? 37 minutes. Okay, so I'll start the next video after this.